10:40 p.m. on April 17, 2013, three masked men forced their way into a vast storage facility in Swords, a quiet northern suburb of Dublin. Once a Motorola factory the size of 2 football fields, the warehouse now served a very different purpose, housing the hidden treasures of Ireland's National Museum. Just minutes from Dublin Airport, the compound sat tucked between bland office parks and modest subdivisions, an unassuming fortress for priceless artifacts. Among those artifacts locked inside were 4 rare rhino heads, relics of the museum's National History Division, affectionately known to Dubliners as the Dead Zoo. The burglars swiftly overpowered the lone night guard, binding him before methodically tearing through the collection. For over an hour, they searched in silence, until at last they uncovered their quarry beneath a dusty tarp. By the time the guard managed to free himself, the thieves had already hauled the heads into a trolley, wheeled them out, and vanished into the darkness. Tucked away in the quiet town of Rathkeil, just 19 miles southwest of Limerick, lies the unlikely birthplace of one of Europe's most elusive organised crime syndicates, the Rathkeil Rovers. With a population barely over 1,500, Rathkeil may seem like any sleepy rural village, but each winter, something shifts. As November rolls in, convoys of BMWs and gleaming Mercedes SUVs crowd its narrow streets. The Rovers return home. They come not quietly, but in a display of wealth and power. Clans vie to throw the most lavish, jaw-dropping weddings of the season. Status is everything. The higher you haul, the higher your place in the clan hierarchy. Among their own, they're called the Gucci Travellers. This quaint Irish town has become the epicenter of a sweeping criminal enterprise that by late 2013 had stunned Europe. Nearly 100 rhino horns had vanished from museums, auction houses, and private collections in 16 countries, many traced back to suspects from Rathkeil. This is the story of our close-knit group of Irish travellers, rooted in tradition and razor-sharp instincts, rose from rural horse fairs to orchestrate multi-million euro heists across the globe, and how international law enforcement raced to catch up. The Rovers' roots stretched deep into Ireland's traveller community, a close-knit, fiercely loyal and historically nomadic group with its own codes, customs and social order. While many trace their lineage to the small town of Rathkeil, their reach stretches across continents. Born Simon Quilligan, he had become better known by the name that echoed through Europe's criminal underworld, Sammy Buckshot, the original architect of the Rathkeil Rovers empire. A traveller by birth, Buckshot got his start in horse fairs and scrapyards, where business often blurred with the con. By the early 1980s, however, he stepped into the world of antiques, and his ambitions stretched far beyond the borders of Ireland. With an uncanny eye for hidden value, he wasn't your average antiques dealer. He was a multi-millionaire in the making. He scoured Ireland and the globe for rare furniture and collectibles, turning old world treasures into serious profit. Claiming once he couldn't read, the Rathkeil native rose to become one of Ireland's most renowned and respected antiques dealers, with his Adair shop drawing collectors from across the globe. But Buckshot's true genius wasn't in what he sold, it was what he saw. Where others saw local rivalries and quick scams, Buckshot saw the potential of organised, mobile crime. He was the first to stitch together the scattered threads of traveller clans into a networked syndicate. Buckshot's success lit a fire in other traveller traders from Rathkeil, sparking a wave of ambition, but not everyone stuck to the right side of the law. Leading the charge were the O'Briens, who took Buckshot's blueprint. From his legacy, the Rathkeil Rovers were born. By the time Buckshot died of cancer in 2015 at the age of 77, the Rovers had grown into one of Ireland's most notorious international crime syndicates, operating internationally. Richard Kerry O'Brien, a key figure in the gang, and often hailed as the king of the travellers, became one of Ireland's wealthiest men. He made a fortune importing luxury furniture from China and built a reputation as a world-class antiques expert, alongside his ally and fellow Rathkeil clan leader, Michael Levin Slattery. In recent decades, the Rathkeil Rovers, including O'Brien, have become a dominant force on the global auction circuit. Their bids on priceless furniture, paintings, and rare artifacts have earned them a reputation among collectors and dealers alike. Many are said to be millionaires. What sets the Rathkeil Rovers apart is the sheer scale of their criminal enterprise. Law enforcement agencies across Europe, North America, South Africa, and Australia have traced their involvement in a staggering array of crimes. Among their most audacious exploits, high-profile art and artifact thefts, with a particular focus on priceless Chinese antiques. But perhaps their darkest and most profitable operation lies in the brutal, blood-soaked world of rhino horn smuggling. Rhino horn, worth more per gram than gold, cocaine, or heroin, once again became a highly sought-after commodity on the black market. Driven by a dangerous myth in traditional Chinese medicine that rhino horn can cure everything from hangovers to cancer, despite there being no scientific foundation, the demand remains insatiable. The rovers were quick to seize on this opportunity, plunging into the trade with a ruthlessness that would come to define their operations. The criminal activity had started years before the infamous Dead Zoo heist, marked by a string of puzzling incidents. Taxidermists and antiques dealers began reporting unusual phone calls from men with Irish accents, inquiring about rhinoceros horns for sale. These callers showed no fear of the law, seemingly unconcerned about the illegalities of transporting or reselling such rare and protected items. Then, the theft started. Initially, they were sporadic, occurring once a month, but soon the pace escalated, reaching a staggering 2 heists a day at the height of their operation. The gang set their sights on natural history museums, auction houses, and private collections across Europe, ruthlessly targeting mounted rhino heads and sawing off their horns. Some heists were violent and audacious, while in others, the thieves used fake identities, posing as buyers or staff members to scout locations before striking with surgical precision. Even when the perpetrators were caught, the horns were almost never recovered. It was a well-known fact. The stolen horns were swiftly chopped into pieces and smuggled to China, where they could fetch up to $65,000 per kilogram. As the thefts persisted, a distinct pattern began to emerge. Museums started taking proactive measures, either removing their rhino specimens from display or replacing the horns with replicas made of plastic or fiberglass. A prime example occurred in 2011 when the gang targeted the Natural History Museum in Tring, UK, stealing rhino horns from taxidermy displays. However, museum staff had replaced the real £240,000 horns with ones made of resin before the burglary took place. For a while, this strategy seemed effective. By mid-2012, the heist had mostly slowed. But then, in 2013, the Dead Zoo burglary shattered the calm, cementing the Rathkeel gang's notorious reputation and earning them a second moniker, the Dead Zoo Gang. In 2013 alone, Irish investigators tracked the Rathkeel rovers across the globe, from the icy reaches of Russia in the east to the sun-soaked shores of the Dominican Republic in the west, from Canada's northern expanse to the remote corners of Argentina in the south, and as far off the beaten path as Australia and New Zealand. The scale and reach of the thefts sent shockwaves through the world of natural history museums, who were blindsided by what seemed like a coordinated assault on one of the few corners of the museum world that had remained largely untouched by crime. Reports of similar incidents flooded in from France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, and Sweden. In a short span, dozens of rhino horns, each valued at hundreds of thousands of pounds on the black market, vanished from European collections. Interpol and Europol were swiftly alerted. These weren't random acts of theft. They were part of a coordinated, organised operation. And as the investigation unfolded, all leads pointed back to Rathkeel. But while the rhino horn trade dominated headlines, the rovers had already shifted their focus to another lucrative criminal enterprise, the theft of Chinese antiques. Between 2009 and 2012, they targeted stately homes and museums across the UK, stealing priceless Qing Dynasty artifacts worth millions. Like the rhino horns, these treasures were destined for wealthy collectors in Asia, eager to pay top dollar for rare, culturally significant pieces. It was clear the rovers had carved out a niche in the theft of cultural and natural heritage, and they were exploiting it with ruthless efficiency. But as with any criminal operation, things didn't always go according to plan. Take 2012 for example. It was the night before Good Friday, and Durham University's campus lay in eerie quiet, the usual buzz of students replaced by a deep stillness. But 2 bumbling thieves, Lee Wildman and Adrian Stanton, hired hands of the gang, who were promised a fixed reward for stealing the items, or anything but steal. Using cloned number plates and armed with a wildly overestimated plan, they crept toward their target, the university's Oriental Museum. Their entry point, the Malcolm MacDonald Gallery. Their method, crude and noisy. chiseling a hole nearly a metre wide straight through a brick wall. It was the kind of approach more suited to a cartoon than a heist, but somehow they made it inside. Once in, they ignored the rest of the exhibits and zeroed in on just two treasures, an 18th century jade bowl and a delicate porcelain sculpture. Both were exquisite examples of Qing dynasty craftsmanship, the final imperial dynasty of China, which ruled from 1644 to 1911. Their all was valued at a staggering £1.8 million. However, the Durham night was hardly a masterpiece of criminal planning. While the burglary followed a prepared strategy, the final stages descended into farce. After making off with the high-valued artifacts, Wildman and Stanton were driven back to the Midlands in an Audi S3. The stolen items were then left at a pre-arranged deposition site on wasteland near Durham's Meadowfield industrial estate. But when Wildman returned 2 days later to retrieve them, he couldn't find them. A witness saw him frantically searching the area, speaking in an agitated manner on his mobile phone, desperately trying to track down the missing treasures. A week before the break-in, Wildman and Stanton were caught on the museum's CCTV testing security during a visit while the museum was still open to the public. After the theft, a fingertip search of the wasteland was launched, prompted by the witness, who after seeing the widespread publicity surrounding the case, realised she'd seen Wildman in the area. On April 13, police recovered the stolen artifacts, but by then, the gang had already moved on to a far more lucrative target. On the very same day the Durham items were found, thieves broke into the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, making off with 18 primarily jade pieces. Together with the Durham artifacts, these treasures could have fetched up to €66 million on the booming Chinese auction market. Over a span of just 4 months, 6 burglaries were carried out, with the Raf Keel gang believed to have been hired by agents acting on behalf of Chinese buyers. The most coveted objects in these heists were those looted from the Summer Palace by French and British forces in 1860. The justification for stealing Chinese antiques, even by such extreme means, stems from a deep sense of loss and humiliation fostered by the Chinese government. While museums may view these as unconscionable thefts, many in China consider them a rightful reclamation of stolen national treasures, property that was taken from them over a century ago. In response to the theft, Europol and Interpol launched Operation Elven, a coordinated effort targeting the Raf Keel rovers across Europe. Wildman and Stanton were arrested 2 weeks after the Durham raid. During the arrest, a phone was recovered from Wildman's underpants, which would ultimately prove to be the key to the gang's downfall. Investigators noticed a sudden spike in phone calls and texts immediately after the stolen items from Durham seemingly went missing in the scrubland. These messages revealed a clear pattern of panic, one that suggested the men were more than just thieves. They appeared to be operating under the direction of a more powerful controlling management structure. Telephone records provided police with the crucial link between the Durham raids and a series of other thefts that occurred between November 2011 and April 2012. Analysing these calls led investigators to a key breakthrough, a call to a vehicle insurance company, which ultimately provided them with the details of Richard Kerry O'Brien Jr. Cross-referencing this information with historical data held by Europol revealed a list of potential suspects, primarily focusing on key members of the Raf Keel gang, the Kerry O'Briens, Michael Hegarty, and Daniel Turkey O'Brien. In November 2013, in a sweeping operation involving 26 police forces and the Serious Organised Crime Agency, UK authorities arrested 19 individuals believed to be members of the Raf Keel rovers. The crackdown resulted in dozens of arrests, along with the seizure of cash, forged documents, and stolen artifacts, including coveted rhino arm. The culmination of years of investigation came in March 2016, when 14 individuals, 12 of them identified as Raf Keel rovers, were sentenced for their roles in a string of high-stakes heists and botched museum thefts across Britain. Following a 27-week trial at Birmingham Crown Court, they were found guilty of conspiring to steal small but exceptionally valuable Chinese artifacts made of jade, lapis lazuli, rhinoceros horn, and other materials in high demand among wealthy collectors in China. Sentences ranged from 15 months to 6 years and 8 months, the maximum penalty for the conspiracy charge being 7 years. 4 of those convicted, all from the same family, were described by prosecutors as the generals of the Raf Keel rovers, the top-tier masterminds who directed the gang's operations. The gang operated with a clear hierarchy, generals at the top, followed by lieutenants and sub-lieutenants beneath them. A jury found 4 of these generals guilty: John Kerry O'Brien Jr., Richard Kerry O'Brien, Michael Eggety and Daniel Turkey O'Brien, each playing a key role in orchestrating the string of meticulously planned heists. On a warm summer evening in June 2010, as the last traces of sunlight began to fade, Kenneth and Paul Corbally sat in their sleek Lexus on Neilstown Road, Clondalkin. The brothers, well-known figures from Ballyfermot, had an air of quiet familiarity with the neighbourhood. With them, in the back seat, was a 14-year-old boy, his wiry frame suggesting he'd recently been busy with the horses he loved so much. He'd accepted a lift, trusting the brothers who shared his passion for horses. Kenneth, behind the wheel, was steady and calm, while Paul lounged in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing at the teenager in the back. They were parked on the side of the road, the air heavy with an eerie silence that seemed to smother the usual evening bustle. Then, without warning, the headlights of a silver Audi A6 pierced the dusk, pulling up alongside their vehicle. It wasn't just another car passing by. Something was wrong. The Audi had a false taxi roof sign and false registration plates, a disguise for the sinister intent of its occupants. Before anyone could react, the Audi lurched forward and rammed into the Lexus. The force jolted everyone inside, the teen's cry of surprise lost in the screech of metal against metal. In the next heartbeat, chaos erupted. Two masked men burst from the Audi, semi-automatic handguns glinting under the dim streetlights. Without hesitation, they opened fire, the sharp cracks of gunshots splitting the night air. Bullets tore through the Lexus, shattering glass and punching through metal, as the attackers unloaded at least 12 rounds into the vehicle. Kenneth and Paul had no chance to defend themselves. The brothers slumped lifeless in their seats, their bodies riddled with bullets. The boy in the back seat was hit, his arm, his chest, but adrenaline coursing through his veins gave him the strength to move. Scrambling out of the blood-soaked car, he staggered down the road, each step a fight against the soaring pain. Somehow, he made it to Tala Hospital, collapsing into the safety of its sterile halls. But even there, safety was a fragile illusion. The hospital erupted into chaos that night. Menacing figures prowled the corridors, their presence sending shivers down the spines of staff and patients alike. They barged into the boy's room, their faces twisted with barely concealed rage. "Keep your mouth shut, or you'll be in trouble," one of them hissed, the threat hanging heavy in the air. Nurses whispered among themselves, terror etched on their faces. The boy's connection to the Corbally brothers, innocent though he may have been, had plunged him into a nightmare. The Corbally brothers were no ordinary victims. Kenneth and Paul were infamous in Ballyfermot's underworld, known as prominent members of a local drugs gang, locked in a deadly turf war. Their enemies were many, their lives shadowed by the constant threat of violence. Horses had been their escape, their shared passion. The boy they'd given a lift to that night had likely crossed paths with them down the stables, drawn in by the simple joys of caring for the animals. As the news of the brutal killings spread, whispers of revenge and rivalry rippled through the streets. The Corbally's death was no random act of violence. It was calculated, precise, and cold. In a world where allegiances could shift like sand, the brothers had paid the ultimate price in a game of power and control. Kenneth and Paul Corbally were the only boys in a family of 5 children raised in a modest local authority house on Drumfin Avenue, just off Ballyfermot Road in West Dublin. Their 3 sisters were known as kind and dependable, but the brothers, along with their father Patrick, walked a far darker path, one that inspired fear rather than respect among those who crossed their path. By the time their lives were brutally cut short, both Kenneth and Paul were fathers, balancing lives as family men with their burgeoning criminal careers. They'd spent much of their adult years moving between Ballyfermot and Clondalkin, where they scraped a living fixing and selling cars. But it was in the 1990s that their trajectory shifted. The brothers joined the ranks of Dublin's infamous M50 gang, trading the world of auto repairs for the high-stakes chaos of car theft, armed robbery, and violence. The M50 gang was a force to be reckoned with, one of the largest and most meticulously organised crime syndicates Dublin had ever seen. The gang earned its name from its audacious exploits, stealing fast cars and tearing across the M50 motorway into South County Dublin, where they launched nocturnal raids on rural businesses. High-value goods like cigarettes and alcohol were their primary targets. and their tactics were as brazen as they were effective. Ram raiding, burglary, and violent robberies became routine, and their arsenal included everything from sawn-off shotguns to walkie-talkies and radio scanners to evade guarded patrols. Kenneth and Paul were central figures in the gang's operations, particularly prized for their uncanny skills behind the wheel. As getaway drivers, they were fearless, pushing vehicles to their limits with complete disregard for their own safety or anyone else's. In one particularly harrowing encounter, the Corbally brothers rammed an emergency response unit vehicle during a high-speed chase, nearly killing the guard officers inside. But the gang wasn't content with car theft and robbery. As their exploits grew more profitable, they used the proceeds to expand into the drugs trade, carving out a criminal empire in West Dublin. Their connections extended beyond Irish borders, forging alliances with violent traveller crime families, and even establishing ties with a Manchester-based heroin gang. For the Corballys, crime wasn't just a way of life, it was their identity. Despite their rise in power, the brothers were known for their short tempers and volatile aggression. To the Gardaí, they were the lowest of the low, criminals who couldn't control their impulses, prone to threatening officers with violence at every opportunity. Their cruelty became their signature. Slashing their victims' faces with knives was a hallmark of their brutality, a grim warning to anyone who dared cross them. Their criminal careers began early. As teenagers, they dabbled in petty theft, but quickly rose to prominence within the M50 gang thanks to their audacity and skill. But their recklessness eventually caught up with them. In 1997, an altercation at the Corbally family home escalated into bloodshed when a man came to collect the car and was shot by Kenneth. Paul joined the attack, beating the victim with an iron bar. The fallout was immediate. Their father, Patrick, was sentenced to 7 years in prison for possession of a machine gun with intent to endanger life. Meanwhile, the brothers fled Ireland to escape arrest, leaving behind a trail of violence and chaos. Despite appearing to live modestly on unemployment benefits, the Corbally family's reality told a very different story. Patrick Corbally, the patriarch, led an affluent lifestyle, flaunting 2 new pickup trucks and a sleek car at their home in West Dublin. It was clear the family's wealth wasn't coming from legitimate means. By the late 1990s, Paul Corbally already had a long criminal record dating back to 1994, including convictions for larceny, public order offences, and assault. The brothers' brief exile from Dublin led them to Manchester, where they joined forces with another Ballyfermot native, John Shawnee Comerford. Comerford, a former M50 gang member like the Corballys, had risen to infamy as a major international drug dealer. Forced out of Dublin in the mid-1990s due to pressure from the Criminal Assets Bureau, CAB, and threats from rival gangsters, Comerford established a heroin empire that spanned continents. From his base in Manchester, Comerford orchestrated an elaborate drug trafficking operation. The heroin, originating in Afghanistan, travelled through Pakistan, Turkey, and the UK before flooding Dublin's streets. Known as King Gear, Comerford dominated the city's heroin trade for nearly 2 decades, earning tens of millions in the process. However, his empire suffered a major blow in 1998 when authorities in Manchester uncovered a £1 million heroin stash during a raid. Comerford was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison in 2000, leaving behind an operation estimated to have trafficked over £40 million worth of drugs into Dublin. With Comerford incarcerated, the Corbally brothers seized the opportunity to step into his shoes. Returning to Dublin, they expanded their influence in West Dublin's drug trade, cementing their status as major players in the underworld. By the early 2000s, they built a reputation on par with Comerford, becoming infamous for their ruthless methods and growing wealth. But their high-profile criminal activities frequently brought them under Garda scrutiny. In 2001, Paul Corbally faced charges after Gardaí stopped their car near Lucan. Inside, they found a balaclava, fake beards, hairpieces, and stage makeup glue, tools clearly intended for disguise. To make matters worse, a large piece of a double-barrel shotgun was discovered hidden down Paul's trousers. Although he was cleared of possessing a critical gun component on the technicality, the evidence painted a damning picture of the brothers' criminal exploits. Paul's troubles didn't end there. In 2002, he was convicted for his role in a violent armed robbery dating back to 1997. The victim, a garage owner in Clondalkin, had been ambushed as he tried to deposit money at a building society. True to the Corbally brothers' signature style, the attack involved ramming the victim's car with a BMW before beating him with a baton. For his role in the robbery, Paul was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Fresh from prison, Paul wasted no time resuming his role as the muscle for John Shawnee Comerford's drug empire. Alongside his brother, he prowled the streets of Ballyfermot, collecting debts and delivering brutal punishments. Known for their slashings and merciless beatings, the Corbally brothers became enforcers feared by all. But their allegiance wasn't limited to Comerford. They also formed an alliance with Michael the Bee Berry, a notorious traveller gangster from the Ladbury Park courting site. Berry's mob was infamous for orchestrating the wave of daring ATM heists that struck fear across the country. Together with the Corballys, Berry carried out a string of robberies in the Midlands and along the southeast coast in the late 2000s. The partnership was lucrative, but short-lived. In June 2009, a €250,000 ATM robbery in Moy Valley marked the beginning of the end. Furious that Berry had gone on a solo run without him, the Corbally brothers demanded their share of the haul, but were told to get lost, with Berry's refusal igniting a bitter feud. Berry struck first. 2 masked and armed men stormed the Corbally family home, issuing violent threats meant to cow the brothers into submission, but the Corballys didn't scare easily. Days later, in a brazen act of retaliation, they carried out an aggravated burglary of Berry's West Dublin residence. Berry's family was terrorised, and his car was stolen. When Gardaí stopped the vehicle near Ladbury Park, they found none other than Paul and Kenneth behind the wheel, defiant as ever. The fallout with Berry was just the beginning of the brothers' troubles. Within the wider criminal network, alliances were fracturing. The Corballys, along with a group of other Ballyfermot and Clondalkin drug dealers, splintered from an organised crime gang they'd once aligned with. The rift mirrored larger tensions within Dublin's criminal underworld, where power struggles were constant and loyalties shifted like quicksand. Comerford and the Corbally brothers were associates of Michael Byrne, a major drug dealing figure who would eventually end up behind bars in 2010, as he was jailed for 18 years after being caught in possession of heroin worth €6.2 million in 2008. Byrne's mob had been involved in a feud with a rival southwest Dublin gang, headed up by Derek Didi O'Driscoll, a drug lord from Ballyfermot, with a penchant for intimidation. Once an ally of Comerford and a fellow member of the M50 gang, Didi had forged his own fearsome reputation. In the 1990s, Gardaí discovered wild animals, a jaguar and a serval, locked in his garage. The creatures weren't just trophies, they were tools of terror, meant to frighten anyone foolish enough to cross him. Convicted of animal cruelty in 1997, Didi's infamy only grew. The shadowy alleys and blood-stained streets of Ballyfermot were no strangers to violence. But September 2009 marked a turning point. Rival factions of the M50 gang, once comrades in crime, had splintered and declared war on one another. It all came to a head one fateful night in what would be forever known as the Ballyfermot bloodbath. The brawl began like so many others, drunken words exchanged, tempers flaring, but the stakes were far higher. Outside Hannigan's pub, a Comerford associate brazenly challenged Derek Didi O'Driscoll to a fistfight. By 1:40 a.m, security guards monitoring CCTV watched in disbelief as 2 men traded blows outside the pub, surrounded by a growing crowd. The fight spilled inside as 3 men, armed with sticks, charged into the bar. Moments later, chaos erupted. A brutal melee involving at least 20 men wielding knives, hockey sticks, broken bottles, and even a hatchet. By the time Gardaí arrived, the scene was a nightmare. Blood poured on the asphalt. 1 man lay dead, brutally stabbed, his lifeless body a testament to the carnage. Another writhed in agony, his intestines spilling from a gaping stomach wound. The dead man was Jason Martin, a UK-based drug enforcer and close friend of the Corbally brothers. His violent end was a bitter blow to Comerford's camp. Gardaí later revealed Martin was wanted in the UK for questioning in a Lancashire kidnapping case just months before his death. 6 months later, in April 2010, the Corbally brothers made their move. Their target, Didi. Armed and determined, they stormed a house in Bluebell where he was holed up, but Didi was no amateur. As the Corballys burst through the front door, he escaped out a bathroom window at the back, vanishing into the night. It was a catastrophic failure for the brothers, a missed opportunity that would haunt them. From that day forward, they were marked men. Just weeks later, the feud boiled over once more. Mark Guinea Pig Desmond, a notorious gangster and ally of the Corbellies, narrowly escaped an ambush while riding a quad bike through Memorial Park. 3 attackers closed in on him, but Desmond's sharp instincts saved his life. Recognizing the hitmen, he sped off as a gunshot rang out. The attempted murder wasn't reported to Gardaí, but it was enough to reignite the already smouldering feud. The Corbelly brothers, enraged by the Memorial Park attack, plotted swift and brutal retaliation. They identified the suspect behind the failed hit and formed a 4-man team with 2 associates. Their target was found sitting in a car in West Dublin. What followed was a savage act of vengeance. The victim was repeatedly stabbed, his body left bloodied and broken, while his vehicle was reduced to shattered glass and twisted metal. The attack sent a clear message, but it did little to bring peace. In Ballyfermot's ruthless underworld, violence only bred more violence. The Corbelly brothers, once feared enforcers, were now embroiled in a feud that had spiraled beyond their control. And as the bloodshed continued, one thing became increasingly clear. No one was safe. The feud with Derek Dee O'Driscoll had reached a boiling point, and the brothers knew they were living on borrowed time. The missed assassination attempt in Bluebell had left Dee hell-bent on vengeance, and his retaliation would be swift and merciless. According to underworld whispers, Dee placed a €40,000 contract on the brothers' heads. The bounty came with a bonus for anyone who ensured the brothers wouldn't live to see another sunrise. In a world where life was cheap and betrayal ran deep, it wasn't long before the hit was carried out with clinical precision. The end came suddenly, as it always did in gangland. A hail of bullets brought the Corbelly brothers' lives and their reign of terror to an abrupt and brutal conclusion. They died as they had lived, side by side, their criminal careers cut short in a storm of gunfire. Initially, Gardaí turned their attention to Michael the Bee Berry and his traveller mob, suspecting their involvement in the Corbelly murders. The long-standing tensions between the brothers and Berry's gang made him an obvious suspect, but as the investigation unfolded, the Traveller gang was ruled out. Rumours surfaced that Berry had reached a truce with the Corbellys just weeks before their execution. Whoever orchestrated the killings, it was clear their motives were rooted in the tangled web of Ballyfermot's gangland rivalries. The double funeral for the Corbelly brothers was as dramatic as their lives had been. Many mourners gathered to pay their respects, but the atmosphere was far from solemn. The tension in the church was palpable, as friends and family of the slain gangsters came to bid their farewells. The elderly priest, his voice trembling with conviction, stood at the altar and condemned the very lifestyle that had led the brothers to their deaths. He spoke of the devastation wrought by the drug trade, his words slicing through the mourners like a blade. Drug dealers have destroyed hundreds of lives in this area, he declared. Choose a life that is honest and decent. But not everyone welcomed his sermon. A female relative of the Corbelly brothers stormed the altar, her voice sharp and defiant, silencing the priest mid-sentence. The message of redemption was drowned in the grief and anger of a family whose loved ones had fallen to the very violence they had perpetuated. As the coffins were carried out of the church, the streets of Ballyfermot whispered the inevitability of it all. The Corbelly brothers had lived by the gun and died by it. On an ordinary August night in 2014, the air at a traveller site in Saggart, dubbed The Ranch, was pierced by the heart-wrenching screams of children. Their father had just been brutally gunned down, riddled with at least 6 bullets. After attending a wedding, he had planned to unwind at home, but fate had a different path. Around 11 p.m, as he watched the rows of Tralee, a masked man armed with a handgun infiltrated the property through an unlocked door. With ruthless precision, the assailant shot the father through a patio window, hitting him multiple times in the upper body. This horrifying act unfolded right before the eyes of his terrified wife and children. As the assassin fled, emergency services were promptly alerted. Gardaí swarmed the scene within minutes, and a helicopter circled above, scouring for any sign of a getaway vehicle. Amid the chaos, a guarder administered CPR to the fallen man, battling to save his life until paramedics arrived. The aftermath was a scene of utter despair. The victim's children cried out in anguish, their voices echoing with the words, oh my daddy," as they were gently led away. Despite the valiant efforts to keep him alive during the ambulance ride to Tala Hospital, he succumbed to his injuries shortly after arrival. Who was the man who was so brutally murdered, and why was he targeted. It is believed that he was killed by an INLA gang member after being entangled in a major financial dispute with a prominent dissident Republican earlier that year. Additionally, he would have clashed with a high-profile Dublin businessman known for his strong connections to dissident Republicans and drug dealers. But why did the INLA focus on him? They had been targeting him and his crew throughout the year, attempting to extort money. The campaign of intimidation included shooting up at least 2 traveller family homes in Tala and the kidnapping and beating of one man. The motive behind these actions became clear. The murdered man was none other than the traveller gang boss, Fat Andy Connors, who, along with his gang, had amassed millions. Before his brutal murder, Connors was largely unknown to the general public. However, within certain circles, he was the go-to man for disposing of stolen goods, deeply entrenched in a network of professional burglars and the traveller community. Connors was a second-generation professional burglar. His father, Michael Miles Connors, was a career criminal with convictions dating back to 1959. Even at the age of 74, Miles was actively involved in crime, earning his 94th conviction in 2013 for acting as a getaway driver during a break-in. He passed away 2 years after his son. Fat Andy Connors was part of the notorious Subaru gang, also known as the Cigarette Gang or Gypsy Gang, along with his cousins Andy Cock Wall and Edward the Bullet Connors. The Subaru gang terrorised the country for years. Notorious for their smash-and-grab raids, they earned their nickname due to their use of high-powered cars to make swift getaways. Their typical modus operandi instilled widespread fear, particularly in rural areas, where the Gardaí struggled to cope. The gang targeted convenience stores and filling station shops, primarily seeking cigarettes. The operation began with a car crew cutting off alarm systems and removing padlocks with angle grinders, then leaving the site to maintain the appearance of normalcy. Next, a second car, often a robust vehicle like a Volvo 740, would reverse into the shop shutters, smashing them open. This car would then drive off, making way for a high-speed getaway car. The gang would quickly enter the shop, break into the cigarette cabinet, and fill the boot with stolen goods before fleeing at reckless speeds. Gardaí, restricted from engaging in such high-risk pursuits, were often left helpless. They brazenly challenged the Gardaí, sometimes stopping mid-chase to threaten the pursuing squad cars, displaying a shocking lack of fear. While rarely participating in the burglaries himself, Connors was the mastermind behind a network of criminals traversing the country's motorways. Sometimes hitting 5 different locations in a single night, they amassed millions. On a single night, they could steal between 70,000 and 100,000 euros worth of cigarettes, which were as good as cash and sold within hours. In addition to cigarettes, they also targeted houses, stealing savings and jewellery from elderly residents. At one point, it was estimated that the gang comprised about 200 individuals, with a hardcore of 80 directly involved. For every active member, there were at least 2 or 3 accomplices providing alibis, moving stolen cigarettes, or hiding goods. Connors and his crew made fortunes, living lavish lifestyles that included luxury cars and expensive champagne. Besides leading the burglary gang, Connors functioned as an underworld banker, lending money to criminal figures for illegal enterprises and laundering the proceeds of their robberies, which terrorised businesses and residents across rural Ireland. In 2004, Connors settled a bill with the Criminal Assets Bureau for 150,000 euros. At that time, he was suspected of making millions of euros through various criminal activities. Although officially he dealt in horses, land, and caravans, he was believed to be involved in drug trafficking and other forms of criminality, serving as a bankroller for illicit operations. He eventually became one of the country's most notorious criminals. Before moving into the ranch, which was the house where he was ultimately murdered, Connors had lived in a caravan behind a mansion on Blessington Road in Sagat. This property, known as the Villa, featured 20 caravans, an indoor swimming pool, a sauna, and 5 bedrooms, and was once valued at 3 million euros. The villa was his first showcase property, though he primarily resided in that caravan on the expansive grounds. When CAB demanded 160,000 euros in unpaid taxes on unexplained income, Connors was forced to put the villa up for sale. However, despite his efforts, he couldn't find a buyer after settling with the CAB. In the years leading up to his death, Connors was a prime target of Operation Fairclough, a massive Garda initiative against burglaries nationwide. This major push led to dozens of Connors' closest associates being brought before the courts. In the period before his murder, Connors was pressuring Jim Mansfield Sr.'s former estate, claiming he was owed money he had invested in dealings with the late millionaire. Behind the scenes, Mansfield Sr., who died in January 2014, was laundering money and washing stolen goods for known traveller gangs, paramilitaries, and some of the country's best-known criminals. Fat Andy Connors had amassed around 30 convictions, including trespassing, assault, possession of an article with intent to cause injury, larceny, malicious damage, possession of drugs, and driving without insurance. In August 2006, he was jailed for 3 years for reckless endangerment after firing a shotgun at a burial in a graveyard in County Wicklow to mark the death of a young relative. While Connors fired the shotgun into the air, another man with him fired it twice into the crowd. A headstone was hit, but nobody was injured. Fat Andy was known for his lavish lifestyle, and his headstone at St Michael's Cemetery in Gorey, County Wexford, reads, "Big Fat Rich Andy Connors." He was buried with a €40,000 Rolex watch and laid to rest in a gold-plated coffin worth €28,000. Thousands of euros were spent on floral displays which included a mobile phone, a box of cigarettes, a flat-screen TV, and a BMW. Connors' extravagant final resting place made headlines in 2015 when a crane was used to erect a 6-foot-high marble statue of Jesus Christ on his grave. The statue, estimated to cost over €50,000, was erected despite protests from some locals unhappy with its size and structure. After his death, Gardaí found nearly €1 million hidden in his bank account. Following Connors' death, his widow Anne was hit with a €2.5 million tax bill, and CAB was granted judgment mortgages against several properties in her name. However, instead of focusing on these troubles, she transformed their property, the ranch, into a sprawling illegal halting site, renting out chalets for €1,500 per week. Additionally, she enlisted the help of Martin the Viper Foley to strong-arm land as payment for debts she claimed were owed to her. That was it for today's video. What are your thoughts on today's topic? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel if you'd like to see our next videos.